Greetings, friends. Today we are analyzing perhaps the most paradoxical and ingenious concept of Aron Nimzowitsch, excessive protection and elimination of weaknesses. At first glance, the term overprotection sounds like cowardice. Why defend a point with 3 pieces if it is only attacked once? But this is the deepest philosophy of positional play. Overprotection is not applied to weak pawns, but to our main strategic basis, such as a strong center or a powerful outpost. Surrounding this point with care, our pieces seem to feed on its energy. They stand like a compressed spring, ready to switch from defense to a crushing attack at any moment. And in the second part of the lesson, we will learn how to ruthlessly get rid of our own weak pawns so that they do not drag us to the bottom. Get your boards ready. We're starting to dissect these subtle strategy tricks. 1. Overprotection of strategically important points. The main purpose of this short chapter is to highlight the various forms of overprotection. We have already explained the meaning and deep meaning of overprotection in the first chapter, paragraph 3. Let us note briefly that the contact between the strong point and the overprotecting pieces contributes both to the strengthening of the point itself, protecting it in advance from possible attacks, and to the increase in the importance of the pieces defending this point, since they draw new strength from it. Overprotection is closely related to positional play. Nevertheless, traces of overprotection can already be established in the elements. Let's take an open line as an example. After the move nc3, d5, the knight outpost, as we emphasized, is protected by a rook in addition to the pawn. But what does this move mean if not overprotection of a strategically important point? In the presence of a pawn chain, the exercise of overprotection is also sometimes a necessary strategic technique. An example is the Nimzowitsch-Giese game. It should be noted that in this game the overprotection was applied not even to the base of the chain d4, e5, that would have been too understandable, but to the stronghold of subsequent operations, e5, for we had to reckon with the inevitable in the case of dxc5. We give the e5 pawn excess protection as follows. Knight d2, knight e7, knight f3, knight g6, rook e1, bishop b4, to move the bishop to c7, c3, bishop a5, bishop f4, third, backup, protection, short castling, bishop g3, bishop c7, knight g5, and now the inner power of the excess defense manifested itself in a striking way. The seemingly lifeless, reserved defenders, knight f3, bishop f4, and rook e1 suddenly became active. Rook f8, knight f4, knight h8, queen g4, knight f8, rook e3, b6, x. It was somewhat better. Bishop d8, knight h5, knight hg6, rook f3, rook e7, knight f6, king h8, and white won by. Knight f takes h7, knight takes h7, knight takes f7, rook takes f7, rook takes f7. The meaning of what happened is as follows. As a result of the overprotection of a strategically important point, the reserve defenders were able to widely deploy active operations against the enemy king. I would like to demonstrate the amazing vitality of pieces who exercise overprotection with 2 more examples. e4, e6, d4, d5, e5, c5, c3, knight c6, knight f3, queen b6, bishop d3, c takes d, bishop d7, bishop e2, knight g7, b3, knight f5, bishop b2, point d4 has so far received only necessary protection, no more. Bishop b4, king f1, h5, g3, rook c8, king g2, g6, h3, bishop e7, In order to respond to the possible move g3 g4 with nh4 check, queen d2, a5, rook c1, bishop f8, queen d1, bishop h6, rook c3, short castling, g4, knight f7, knight a3. Only now does it become clear why white was slow to develop this knight. They intended to use the knight to overprotect d4. Knight b4, knight c2. This is followed by an unexpectedly quick unraveling of the tangle of white pieces on the queen side. Rook takes c3, bishop takes c3, knight takes c2, queen takes c2, rook c8, queen b2. Whatever happens, point d4 is and remains overprotected. Bishop b5, bishop takes b5, queen takes b5, bishop d2. The piece that exercises overprotection begins to show its claws. Bishop f8, rook c1, h takes g, h takes g, rook c6, queen a3. The second piece exercising overprotection does not lag behind the first. Rook takes c1. It's a pity, after knight f5 white was going to offer a queen sacrifice. Rook takes c6, bishop takes a3, rook c8, king g7, g takes f with a strong attack, an excellent indicator of the internal elasticity of pieces that provide overprotection. Queen takes c1 with the best game for white. The second example, e4, e6, d4, d5, e5, c5, knight f3, knight c6, c3, queen b6, bishop e2, c takes d, c takes d, knight h6, knight c3. Be careful. b3. See the previous example. Knight f5, knight a4, queen a5, bishop d2, bishop b4, bishop c3, bishop d7. It deserved preference. Bishop takes c3, knight takes c3, queen b4, queen b6, knight a4, bishop b5, short castling, bishop takes c6, queen takes b2, knight a4, queen b4, queen d2. White would have the c5 point, and black would have an extra, albeit backward, pawn. a3, bishop takes c3, knight takes c3, h5, short castling, rook c8. White now develops his pieces so that the d4 point is more than defended. And queen d2, queen d8, with the threat of g7 g5, h3, to be able to parry g5, knight a5, g5 counterattack, g4 for example, h takes g, h takes g, knight h4, knight takes h4, rook takes h4, king g2 followed by rh1 and white's advantage. Rook ad1, queen b6, rook fa1 point d4, and to a certain extent e5, systematically receives overprotection, and this strategy makes it possible to deal with all complications later, so to speak, automatically. Knight c4, bishop takes c4, rook takes c4, knight e2, bishop a4, rook c1. Overprotecting pieces can be used everywhere. The d1 rook on c1 and the e2 knight on g3. Bishop b3, rook takes c4, bishop takes c4, knight g3, knight e7, and white's position is somewhat better. White won on move 61. In the examples above, we talked about overprotecting the base of the pawn chain. No less important is the overprotection of other points, which we will now proceed to consider. A. Overprotection of central points. We have already had occasion to note the frequent disdain for the central theater of operations. Here we would like to clarify one more detail, namely, to give an assessment of a certain situation, which is very characteristic of the hypermodern style of play. As you know, hypermodernists are perfectly able to restrain the impulse to occupy the center with pawns, although only until the first favorable opportunity. If the right moment has come, all reverence for principle is immediately discarded, and the pawns, supported by the fianchetto bishops, advance vigorously, occupy the center, and seek to strangle the opponent. It is against this misfortune that overprotection of the central points is a reliable means that we warmly recommend. Consider the beginning of the next game as an example. Knight f3, d5, c4, e6, g3, knight f6, bishop g2, bishop d6, b3. Short castling. Why such a hurry? Since consolidating the center is a much more important matter. c7, c6, and b8, d7, and e6, e5. Short castling. Rook e8, bishop b2, knight bd7, d3. The resulting situation is undoubtedly more advantageous for black. White should have played d4, c6, knight bd2, e5, c takes d, c takes d, rook c1, knight f8, rook c2, bishop d7, queen a1, knight g6, rook fc1. Black's move. Which clause deserves overprotection here? The queen maneuver is significant. White wants to destroy the center of the opponent by playing d3, d4 on occasion. But if black responds with e5, e4, then in f3, e5 will follow. It follows that black had to defend e5 in excess. The best thing was at first b5 to target the queen side, compromised by the position of the queen on a1. If then, knight f1, then queen b8, overprotection of e5, knight e3, a5 with a significantly better game for black. This method of play, which I had already mentioned earlier in 1924, met with little sympathy at that time, since the idea of overprotection was completely unknown to the chess world. Today, the attitude is different. During the tour in the autumn of 1926, I happened to put the queen on b8 quite often, with about the same tendency as in the above game. I would like to cite one of the games played at that time because of its high instructiveness. Knight f3, e6, g3, d5, bishop g2, c6, b3, bishop d6, bishop b2, knight f6, d3, knight bd7, knight bd2, queen c7. The move in the game is the beginning of an original maneuver. Black has planned an attack on the queen side, but wants to first secure the center from a possible threat e2, e4, e5. So, the systematic implementation of overprotection of the central point e5. In particular, the queen has a spare square on b8, where it can retreat if necessary, for example, when the c line is opened. It is possible, and e5. Short castling. a5. c4. b5. The question of the timing of a flank attack always depends on the position in the center. With a fortified position in the center, a flank attack cannot be absolutely wrong. So it is here. What if the king has not yet rooked? He is still safe. c takes b. c takes b. Rook c1. Queen b8. Queen c2, e4 seems to be more urgent. Short castling. e4. Bishop b7. Knight d4. Rook c8. Queen b1. Rook takes c1. Rook takes c1. b4. Knight c6. This move seems a little premature to me. Bishop takes c6. Rook takes c6. a4. Every free chance is used to strengthen the position on the queen side. d4. This move should be regarded as a success of black strategy built on the principle of overprotection. The important diagonal b2 f6 now obstructed, but otherwise it would not be possible to advance e4 e5. It is also worth mentioning the move of f4 in which the d3 pawn remains in place. It could have followed bishop c5 and white still has to play d4 after bishop f8. e5 the situation would have been the same as in the game. Bishop f8, e5, knight e8, white bishops are inactive. f4, queen b5 more precisely, there was an immediate a3. Queen c2, a3, bishop c1 with the help of material sacrifice. Black invades the opponent's camp and conquers the fixed a2 pawn. How? It was necessary to play it beforehand. Bishop f1, f1, f1. Bishop c5. This interesting combination should have been started with a move. Knight c5. The difference will soon become clear. Rook takes c5. Knight takes c5. D takes c. Move. Bishop f1, impossible at nc5, would give white extra tempo for the endgame. Rook c8. The a2 pawn, who would have thought, is doomed. Knight b1. Queen takes c5. Queen takes c5. Rook takes c5. Bishop takes a3. Or bishop d2. Rook c2. Bishop f1. Rook takes a2. Bishop takes b4. Rook g2 and black wins. If white had extra tempo, this variation would not have been possible. B takes a. Knight takes a3. Rook a5. Knight c2. Rook takes a2. Knight d4. Rook b2. f5. Knight c7. F takes e. Knight takes e6. Knight c6. d4. White resigned. B. Overprotection of the center as a measure to strengthen one's own royal flank. The case under explanation differs from the previous one in its tendency, so it is treated here as an independent maneuver. An analysis of the situation in the Nimzowitsch-Alekhine game concerns a case characteristic of this maneuver. In this sense, the Nimzowitsch-Freiman game is also instructive. After e4, knight f6, knight c3, d5, e5, knight fd7, f4, e6, knight f3, c5, g3, knight c6, bishop g2, bishop e7, short castling, d3, knight b6. Alekhine found himself in a cramped position as he did not play f6, x. The sequel was knight e2, d4, g4, preparation of a strong attack, f6, e takes f, g takes f, otherwise the knight will be centralized by means of n2, g3, e4, knight g3, knight d5, queen e2, bishop d6, knight h4, knight c7, bishop d2, queen c7, queen f2, and now the inner strength of black's centralized formation showed itself in an unexpected maneuver. c4, d takes c, knight e3, leading to the equation of the game. Black's last move was g4. White repels the attack on the king by over-defending the center. How? Rook e1 by strengthening the center. they simultaneously increase the resistance of their position also against flank attacks. In response to h takes g, queen takes g for they outlined. Rook takes h2 followed by b's 5 check and bxb2, xb2, 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 xb followed. King f8, knight c3, the beginning of the blockade maneuver. Queen e7, bishop takes f5, e takes f, queen e3, rook h6, knight e2, c5, knight f4 with the best game for white, because with such a strong position of the knight, even the presence of two bishops does not matter much. In addition, the overall mobility of the black pawns is quite insignificant. The c5 and d5 pawns still have some mobility, while the rest are blocked. A particularly prominent example is the maneuver chosen in the next game. The knight d5 is undoubtedly the pride of black's position. However, the game plan is not easy to find. White is going to seize the initiative with a maneuver, not particularly scary, however, qe2, d2 followed by nf3, e1 d3 c5. The consistent train of thought in this game led me to the trail of a hidden maneuver, which still seems to me to be very good. Here are the individual links in this logical chain. 1. nd5 is strong. 2. This means that the pieces that perform overprotection are also strong. qd7 and rd8. 3. But the rook d8 must also defend the king's position, and this weakens the force of its influence on the center. Therefore, for the rook, h must be on c8. King b8, queen d2, rook c8, knight e1, bishop e7, knight d3, rook hd8 goal achieved. The d8 rook can now be used entirely for operations in the center, while the king is defended by the c8 rook. The viewer learns about the further fate of the d8 rook at the end of the video. The game will show that the overprotecting pieces have once again fully displayed their inherent strength. Many more points worthy of overprotection could be listed, but we will confine ourselves to the few examples given here. Before moving on to the next strategic maneuver, however, we would like to emphasize once again that overprotection should be applied only to strategically important points, and not to weak pawns, a loose kingside, and the like. Overprotection is by no means an act of Christian charity. The pieces defend the clause once again because they are counting on certain strategic benefits. A weak pawn has the right to overprotection only in one case, namely, when it performs the functions of the nurse of a growing giant. For example, white pawns d4 and e5, black pawns e6 and d5. The base of the d4 chain, although weak, serves as the breadwinner of the strategically important e5 pawn. Therefore, in this case, overprotection of paragraph d4 is quite appropriate. 2. Elimination of their own weak pawns. We do not want to talk about how they are disposed of, but rather only about which pawns deserve the indicated, not particularly kind, treatment. The situation is always the same. In general, a healthy pawn complex, but it has a weak pawn in its composition. In the degree of weakness, we distinguish two cases. A. The weakness of the pawn is obvious. B. Weakness manifests itself only after a pawn advance, owner enemies. For each of the cases, we give an example. Rook c5, bishop d7. Or bishop d3, king c1. Rook d7, rook c8 followed by rb8. Rook takes d5, so white now has an extra pawn. King f8, king c2, b3, king c3, king e7. White can now consolidate his pawn position, the e, f, and g pawns, via e3, e4. The rook d5 will then be free. However, the h4 pawn is weak, threatening on occasion, for example, in a rook endgame, the RA7, a 1H1 maneuver and RxH4. So white gets rid of this pawn. H5, bishop E6, rook C5, king D6, rook C6, king D7, H takes G, H takes G, goal achieved. Knight takes E6, F takes E, rook C5 followed by RC5, G5, and F3, F4. The rook ending is easily won. As an example of the second case, we will cite the end of one of Teresh's early games. Black played rook c6, and the game continued as follows. Rook hc1, rook hc8, g4, g6, f5, g takes f, g takes f, rook g8. In no case should f5 f6 check be allowed. It was necessary to play e takes f, for example. Knight f4, bishop e6, rook g1, and the struggle would be very stubborn. f6, king f8, rook g1, rook takes g1, knight takes g1, king g8, and the h7 pawn is an obvious weakness. However, black could have avoided this by playing instead of rc6. h5 instead of nc6, with a tendency to allow f4, f5, f6, as in the game, only on the condition that both the g-pawn and the h-pawn are exchanged and disappear from the board. It could have followed h3, g6, but not h4 due to knight g1 followed by nf3, and black would have reached a better position in a few moves than in the game. While the first case of an obvious pawn weakness does not place great demands on the player, the correct strategy in the second case, when this weakness is hidden, is extremely difficult. First of all, it requires a fairly accurate knowledge of the various forms in which the advance of a compact pawn mass is usually revealed, especially on the flank. But we have devoted a considerable number of pages in the book to this advancement with all its consequences, and therefore we can safely leave the reader to a fate, hopefully favorable to it. If only he would also remember that the sometimes emerging strategic need to get rid of an interfering pawn can also appear in the case of the planned advance of one's own pawns, and not only when the enemy's pawns are moving. Whether to get rid of a weak pawn before or during an operation, compact pawn advance, must be decided on a case-by-case basis according to the specific characteristics of the position. We shall now give a game illustrating overprotection and then begin a new chapter. In addition to overprotection, this game also illustrates the problem of the isolated queen's pawn. e4, knight c6, d4, d5, e5, f6. Bishop b5 f4 is considered the best continuation. Bishop f5, knight f3, queen d7, c4. Bishop takes b1. The motive for this strange exchange is the desire to seize the d5 point for the knight. Rook takes b1, long castling, c takes d. If c5 then, g5 after that. A struggle for possession of the central point, e5, begins. For example, queen e2 with the threat of e5, e6 to squeeze black. Queen e6, a3, knight h6 followed by nf7. Perhaps it would have been knight b8 in both cases. Black is doing well. Queen takes d5, bishop takes c6, queen takes c6, short castling, e6, bishop e3, knight e7, queen e2, knight d5 with a clear conscience. We can consider the d4 pawn isolated. Its weakness, in the endgame, is obvious, and the d5 point is very strong for black. As for the advantages of an isolated pawn, the outpost point c5 for the f3 knight is good, but e5 is not suitable. In general, the game, perhaps, is equal. Rook fc1. It is difficult to say whether the exchange on f6 did not deserve preference instead of moving the rook on c1. E takes f black would, however, get the g-file and the centralized bishop d6, but white would have the e-file. The kind of overprotection that black now carries out has already been discussed in detail. Queen d7, rook c4, king b8, queen d2, rook c8, knight e1, bishop e7, knight d3, rook hd8, queen c2, f5. Having strengthened his position, black launches an attack, which, however, is not easy to conduct because, firstly, there are no vulnerable points, and secondly, white himself has some chances to attack. Rook c1, g5, knight c5, bishop takes c5, rook takes c5, rook g8, queen e2, h5, bishop d2. If queen takes h5, then g4, and then rh8. h4, a4, g4, a5, a6, b4, c6. White's initiative has finally fizzled out. Rook b1, queen f7, rook b3, f4, queen e4, f3, rook c1, g takes f, g takes f, king f1. Rook cf8 would be disastrous for white. This is stronger than rook g1. F takes g. King takes g2. Rook cf8. The ease with which the black rooks were used for the attack is noteworthy. However, in my eyes, this is another proof of the great vitality of pieces who exercise overprotection. Rook f1, g3, h takes g, h takes g, f4. Move. Rook takes g3 after. Rook takes g3 would have deprived the king of all cover. Knight e7, bishop e1. On the rook takes g3, now it will follow. Knight f5, rook g5, rook takes g5, and nh4 check. Knight f5, rook h1, rook g4, bishop takes g3, queen g6, queen e1, knight takes g3, the decisive move. Black simply and artlessly wins all the pawns, as if placed by white on the fourth rank specifically for this purpose. Rook takes g3, rook f takes f4, rook h3, rook takes d4, queen f2, rook takes g3, rook takes g3, queen e4, king h2, queen takes e5, king g2, queen d5. White resigned. One of my favorite games. As we have seen, overprotection of strategically important points is not passivity, but a hidden threat that gives our pieces incredible elasticity and freedom of maneuver. And the timely elimination of one's own pawn ballast deprives the enemy of objects for attack. Now we know how to concrete our strengths and get rid of weaknesses. Our position is monolithic. But what to do next? How to crack the enemy's defenses if he has also built a strong fortress and reliably protected his vulnerable points? A direct attack will not work here. We will need more sophisticated weapons. And this is what our next video will be devoted to, where we will analyze the masterclass of positional maneuvering, the art of maneuvering. Support this video with a like so that new lessons come out faster, and see you at the chessboard in the next chapter.